What's up, everybody? It is Thursday, March 3rd. Little pullback in the markets here, some headline trading. There was a meeting between Ukraine and Russia, their representatives trying to work out a ceasefire arrangement. That did not work out, and then the market sold off, although they did come to an agreement on providing humanitarian corridors, access corridors, to allow people to get away, to escape, and that is a good development. But the war continues, and that is going to dominate the headlines right now. I listened to a very interesting podcast yesterday. It was the Odd Lots podcast. It's a Bloomberg podcast. I'm going to put the link here in the description. And the person who was the guest was Zoltan Pozar. He is an interest rate analyst at Credit Suisse. You may see him quoted frequently in the blog Zero Hedge if you watch that. But he's a smart dude. And he brought up a very interesting point, which I think becomes an obvious point now in light of all the sanctions and the freezing of assets and this sort of stuff. He talked about the distinction between inside money and outside money, or inside assets and outside assets. And let me define what those are. Inside assets would be assets within a system, let's say a banking system. It would, for example, be deposits at a central bank or deposits at a commercial bank, which are essentially liabilities that the central bank owes to someone else, maybe another central bank, or that liabilities that a commercial bank owes to a business or an individual. For example, when you deposit money in your checking account, that's a liability for the bank. They have to have that on demand when you demand it. The problem with inside assets, and that's sort of like how most assets are defined, okay? They're parked somewhere in a banking system. The banks, including central banks, can renege on that liability. In other words, they could just decide, hey, we're not going to give you your money. So those sort of assets, inside assets, which again are the dominant form of assets in the global financial system. Everything is electronic, it's credits and debits, and they reside on some bank balance sheet somewhere, whether that's a central bank or a commercial bank or whatever. Those are very easy to seize. All right, it's just a matter of the bank or the institution saying, oh, we're not going to give it to you. If it's by an order from somebody, let's say a very powerful entity like the United States government, who says, freeze those assets here in the United States, or directs European banks or the ECB for that matter to say, freeze those assets, you can't get them. So it makes those assets very vulnerable. And he made the distinction of outside assets, which are assets that you own and you have control over, okay? And he brought up the example of gold. As long as gold is stored at the central bank of the country in question, then that's an asset that's very hard, almost impossible for somebody else to seize. And he also said the interesting thing about gold is that it can be repoed, like a repurchase agreement. Same thing with like treasuries or something like that, where you pledge the gold in exchange for something. It could be another currency, it could be dollars, it could be yen, it could be Swiss francs, it could be British pounds, whatever. It's a standard repurchase agreement like a treasury. So the gold is the collateral which you have physically, and nobody could freeze it, nobody could take it. And as long as you find a counterparty to enter into that transaction, where, let's say, they pledge the dollars or the yen or whatever, and it doesn't mean it has to come to you directly. It could be arranged where, let's say, you need to pay a creditor. That transfer is made directly to that creditor, and then eventually that whole thing is unwound, where the counterparty in the repurchase agreement, they release the claim on the gold, and the currency is paid back to the originator. So it's very interesting now in light of, this has been, we've seen sanctions before, all right? We've seen plenty of sanctions before, going all the way back to 2014 and even before that. By the way, before I get into that, you have to have your outside asset with you. In other words, you look at the situation of Venezuela that had a lot of gold, but it was being held by the Bank of England, and the Bank of England seized its gold. So that's essentially the gold in the Venezuela's gold was really an inside asset because they allowed it to be held at the Bank of England rather than holding it in Venezuela. And now the Bank of England basically stole Venezuela's gold because they don't like Maduro. So, there's an example where, you have to be careful. If it's an outside asset, you have to have control over it. So what was I going to say? Yeah, in light of, we've seen sanctions before, certainly in 2014, even prior to that, but this has been, unprecedented on a global scale. The seizure of assets as a reaction to Russia's invasion into Ukraine, which, by the way, I'll say again, there's been 30 years of Russian pleadings and warnings saying, look, we cannot accept a further eastward expansion of NATO. It is a security threat to our, many, many high-level foreign policy experts, former Defense Department people, including Bob Gates. A lot of people have been saying this over many, many years, that the expansion of NATO eastward to the Russian borders and surrounding borders with dual capable missiles, that means conventional and nuclear, is an existential threat to Russia, and Russia was going to eventually react to that. And that's been known. Like, you could listen to the media and fall for all that propaganda and think like, oh, this was an unprovoked thing, but no, there's been 30 years, okay, and it really started to accelerate in 2008 at the Bucharest conference, when NATO said, okay, now we're going to go after Georgia and we're going to go after Ukraine, and then that started the Russian war with Georgia. Russia saw the writing on the wall, but I don't want to get sidetracked in this. I'm saying now that we have seen the global response to what has happened in the sense of unprecedented, massive, just extraordinary sanctions, the seizure of assets everywhere. They're going after oligarchs, which I have no problem with that. If I could just say this as a kind of a side note, it's the highest example of irony that the oligarchs looted the wealth of the Russian people, and now the United States and its allies, Europe, they're going to steal that away from the oligarchs. So again, the Russian people are never going to get that wealth that belonged to them. That was national wealth. Those are industries and deposits and minerals and all national wealth that belonged to the Russian people, looted. And I'll even add, it was looted at the encouragement of the West and the United States at the time when the Soviet Union went down. They made deals with Yeltsin, and Yeltsin allowed that to happen. Looted by the oligarchs, and now the Americans and the Europeans are going to steal that for themselves. So it's the highest example of irony that I could think of. Anyway, now it's pretty obvious, or it will be pretty obvious to the world, that sanction risk is a factor in reserve accumulation by central banks. All of them must be thinking about this if they're like a non-Western aligned, if you're not UK, if you're not United States, if you're not, the lackeys in Europe or Germany, whatever. China's got to be thinking about this. They own over $1 trillion in treasuries, which the United States, that's a liability to the United States, could say, okay, we're not paying you back. I mean, China's got to be thinking about this. A lot of countries have to be thinking about this. So what does this mean? I think in terms of central bank holdings of reserves, there's going to be a consideration now about sanction risk. Like, what currencies are we holding in reserve and what is our sanction risk? And clearly the dollar tops the list as a currency with a very high risk, sanction risk of being sanctioned. I mean, the United States can do to anyone what it's just done to Russia or what it's done to other countries, Venezuela, Iran, whatever. Very simple for the United States to do something like that. Same thing with the euro now. The fact that the ECB is participating in this, assets, euro assets being frozen, Russian euro assets being frozen, same thing. I think the euro has not only sanction risk, but now it has war risk. All right, I don't think that's very good for the euro. So what's going to happen? One could postulate, let me postulate. I think there's going to be a consideration now within central banks about what currencies they hold in reserve and which of those currencies are subject to the greatest amount of sanction risk. There's going to be a consideration of that. One thing I want to mention is that the Chinese currency, China is not sanctioning Russia. They've been kind of wishy-washy on their condemnation. They're not fully backing Russia. In fact, they said, that things should end. You should come to some peaceful agreement. So, China's playing both sides. China can't afford to break its ties or tarnish its relationship with particularly the United States, because a lot of its economy is dependent on exports to the United States, and technologically there's a lot of things shared, etc. But I think what's going to happen is there's going to be a consideration on the part of central banks as to what currencies they're going to hold in reserve and which ones have the highest sanction risk, and by the same token, they may consider more gold, which could be held as an outside asset, all right, that is not subject to sanctions, that has, I guess, a money aspect to it in the sense that you can enter into repurchase agreements and use that as a form of a payment system. I don't know. I mean, it's speculation on my part. I absolutely see where, this almost certainly is going to have to come into the thinking of central banks around the world. I mean, it's one thing when we saw isolated instances of sanctioning and everybody else was okay and it was like a pariah nation. Everyone thought like, okay, it's Iran, we could do that to Iran, or it's Venezuela, we could do that to them. And it was just the United States doing the sanctioning, or maybe, another European country. But now when the whole entire world, I mean, it's got to be a consideration. So what am I saying? I'm not even sure what I'm saying here. I'm just thinking we could be on the verge of like an unbelievable paradigm shift, like a once-in-a-generation paradigm shift that may affect the dollar to some extent. It doesn't mean that, there's going to be a liquidation of dollars. And by the way, there's only one way for the world to get rid of its dollars, and that is to exchange the dollars for goods and services produced in the United States, which means like the United States would have to become a net exporter, and that's not going to happen anytime soon. But I could see where there could be a slow reduction, in dollar reserve holdings, and maybe an inclination more into, for example, into something like gold. Somebody asked me today about Bitcoin. I don't know if governments have the ability to grab Bitcoin or something. I confess I don't know too much about that. But I mentioned China earlier in the Chinese currency, the RMB. Since China has not sanctioned Russia, it might seem like, a currency that is more favorable to hold in reserve because it has a lower sanction risk attached to it. It's hard to hold RMB in reserve because China is a large net exporter. But if countries really want to hold RMB in reserve, it would probably entail reducing the exchange rate of the local currency in order to be more attractive as an exporter into the Chinese economy. I mean, like I said, a whole bunch of stuff can happen from this. I'll put up the link. You can listen to Posar's he was the guest on that podcast, and check it out for yourself. But if you can figure this one out, and it's a long-term thing, but if you can figure this one out, I mean, fortunes are going to be made off of this, because this is going to be a secular, long-term trend that's just going to keep going now. It's going to unwind probably something. If it happens the way I'm thinking, this unwinds. I mean, this goes all the way back to Bretton Woods. What was it, like 1947 or something like that? So it's big. It's really big. Anyway, that's it for today, folks. Have a good day. Bye.